All right, let's look at verse 14 and 15, finish off this paragraph. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. All right, so I am under obligation to who, Paul? Both to Greeks and to barbarians. Okay, anybody else? Both to the wise and to the foolish. What is owed, Paul? What are you under obligation? Under obligation for what? So I'm eager to preach the gospel. Okay. So maybe it's the gospel that you owe if you're eager to preach the gospel. If you're under obligation to these people, Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish, so essentially everybody. I'm eager to preach the gospel. Eager. Eager, like the word long we saw earlier. Eager to preach the gospel. To who? Who, Paul? Who are you eager to preach the gospel to? You also who are in Rome. I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. So Paul owes everyone the gospel, and he's excited to preach it to the Christians in Rome. So Romans 1:14, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Look at a couple translation comparisons. You might see the word debtor. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. And this is probably the more literal translation. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and unwise. And we see this when we look at some of the other ways that this word pops up. We see it in Matthew 6, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him, the idea of debting, 10,000 talents. So Paul owes something both to the Greeks and to the barbarians. And we said in the previous slide that what we think he owes is the gospel. We get that from the next verse where he says, so I'm eager to preach the gospel. The debt that's owed is the gospel. So, but why does Paul owe them the gospel? And why does he owe Greeks and barbarians? And I think it's awesome that we see this word show up in Matthew 18:24, because this is the parable of the 10,000 talents, which I think someone was telling me recently that's like $1 billion. And essentially the story of the 10,000 talents is this, is that Jesus talks about someone who came and was forgiven this debt of 10,000, like $1 billion, like a crazy, ridiculous amount, a debt that could never be paid. For some reason, he owed him 10,000, $1 bazillion. So the debt, the parable is, it's the debt of sin. And then he turns around and walks off, and someone else comes up who owes him 1 talent, like $500 or something like that, $1,000. So he just gets $1 billion forgiven, and then he doesn't forgive someone else the debt of $500. So Paul says, I owe the Greeks and the barbarians, the wise and the unwise, something. I owe them the gospel. And why does he owe it to them? See, why does Paul owe this to them? See, here's the thing. Paul doesn't... You'd think that Paul owed God something for his grace. And indeed, he did. He's in a debt. He's in a debt of sin, but that was forgiven him. Think back to this parable of the 10,000 talents. That was forgiven him. Paul owes that. And so what does that mean? That means that if you get a gift of grace, you turn around and you owe it to others. He's not a debtor to God anymore because that's been paid. You can't owe a debt to grace, because if you do that, then grace is no longer grace. If Paul was trying to pay God back for the grace that he received, then he would be making that gift of grace no longer a gift anymore. And that we know that that's not the goal. So he's not a debtor to grace. You can't pay it back. Paul's not paying God back for his sins. He's not paying him back for this 10,000. He's not saying, okay, God, thanks for forgiving my 10,000 talents. I'm going to go and try and pay them back to you. No, he's not. But what happens when you get a gift, you owe it to others. I think it's more like this. Paul received the gospel freely, and therefore he owes it to everybody else. Think of it more like if you receive the cure to a disease that is ravaging the world, ravaging your nation. A disease starts ravaging it, and freely someone comes up and says, here's the cure. I have the cure to the disease. Don't you kind of owe it to the rest of the world to say, I have this. It was freely given to me. I have the cure. I owe you the cure. So that's why I think the debt that is owed to these Greeks and barbarians, wise and unwise, and essentially I think that just means everybody. I owe you the gospel. I am a debtor to you. I'm a debtor to the world, to all the Gentiles. I owe you the gospel. It's an awesome phrase. So, I'm eager to preach it. Questions? Who is the Greeks and barbarians? Who's the wise and the foolish? And then a massive, huge, crazy question that this needs to rock our world. All of this, so I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also. Who is the you? The you is the called and the loved, the Christians, the Roman believers. That's who he wants to preach the gospel to. Why do you preach the gospel to Christians? That is a question worth asking.